Let me give you the overview here. We are looking at Form 8839. So we're speaking about qualified adoption expenses. So you first put your first name, last name, and then you put your social security number. And here we have part one. So part one, you have to put child number one. You put the first name, last name, and the birth year of the first child, and the child social security number. And then child two, you put again the birth year here and the social security number. And if this is an adopted child, you have to check the appropriate box in column G, as you can see on the screen here. So basically, for Cutie Kiwi, we adopted her, and for Kitty Kiwi, we actually this is a biological child. By the way, all those names are fictitious here. This is a hypothetical example. And one thing I want to say here, let's move on to part two. So part one is pretty straightforward, nothing complicated. Part two, you have adoption credits. So here we have to go a little granular here. This is where the IRS wants more information from you. So we basically put information for child one and child two. So the maximum adoption credit per child. And this is actually the IRS is telling you the maximum is $15,950. And on line three, if there is if yes applies, you put yes. So we have 10,000, 10,000. So when you subtract line three from line two, you have a 5,950 in both columns. And basically the qualified adoption expenses in both columns amounted to 3,050 and 4,050. And so on line six here, we follow the instructions and we have the same amounts. And here I'm entering my hypothetical adjusted gross income is $150,000. And so basically line 9 does not apply to us. Line 10, we put 00. Line 11 amounts to 3,050 and 4,050. And when you follow the math that the IRS is telling you on this screen here on this form, basically line 12 amounts to 7,100, and it's the same amount that you have on line 14, and line 15 actually amount to 5,000, and basically the adoption credit here is 5,000, depending on your situation. Here I'm showing you additional credits and payments for this year on Schedule 3, Form 1040, which you will need to actually transpose data on anyway. And then I'm showing you the exclusion of prior year benefits worksheet, which is something you will need also for your Form 8839. By the way, boss, welcome back to the show. It's really a pleasure to have you here. Make yourself comfortable. You are going to enjoy today's conversation. I want to talk to you about part two now. So we're talking about part two, and part two here you have child one and child two, and basically you follow the same instructions here. And basically, if you receive the employer provided adoption benefits from a prior year for the same child, you put it, and we did not. So we did not. So in our case, it's 00. Line 19, we have 15,950. Same amounts for child one and child two. Remember, child one is a biological one. Child two is adopted. And on line 20, we have 2,500 in both cases. And when you add those two, those 2,500, so 20 and 20, 21B and 21 and 20A and 20B, you have 5,000. You put that on line 21. And for 22, you follow the instructions, 2,500 in both columns. And the adjusted gross income, 150,000. That's what I used a little earlier. And basically here, you follow the same strategy here. So excluded benefits on the line 27, we have a 2,500 in both cases. And then if you add the amounts on line 27, so line 27A and line 27B, when you add 2,500 to 2,500, you have 5,000. Okay. And so basically line 29 is pretty straightforward. It's asking you about taxable benefits. And if line 28 is more than line 21, basically, now we'll look at line 28. Line 28 is a 5,000, right? Line 21 is 5,000. So in those cases, those are the same. So we put no here. So you can see that we put no. So if it's no, then you have to subtract line 28 from line 21. And also you have to include this amount if more than 0 on line 1F of Form 1040, Form 1040 SR or 1040 NR. In our case, things were pretty straightforward. Everything is 0. So we do not have to put this amount on Form 1040, 1040 SR or 1040 NR. And what I want to say is that basically, of course, for sake of time, we actually chose a very simple hypothetical case to sort of show you how the math works. But if you have any question, any concern, please let us know in the comment section and we'll get back to you. By the way, boss, I want to quickly remind you of today's topic. We are having a conversation about Form 8839. Let me give you the approach you need to really follow here when it comes to Form 8839, qualified adoption expenses, okay? Now, you can claim both the credit and the exclusion for expenses of adopting an eligible child, and qualified adoption expenses are reasonable and necessary expenses directly related to and for the principal purpose of the legal adoption of an eligible child. Now, the child has to be eligible, very important. Now, when we talk about qualified adoption expenses, we are speaking about a series of expenses that relate to the adoption of a child, okay? You have adoption fees, you have attorney fees, you have court costs, you have travel expenses, including meals and lodging while away from home, and you also have readoption expenses relating to the adoption of a foreign child. And in some cases, those expenses can be really, really high. Now, qualified adoption expenses do not include expenses for which you receive funds under any state, local, or federal program that violate state or federal law, for carrying out a surrogate parenting arrangement, for the adoption of your spouse's child, reimbursed by your employer or otherwise, allowed as a credit or deduction under any other provision of federal income tax law. And additional information on adoption expenses, including eligible child rules and employer-provided adoption assistance, may actually be found in the IRS instructions for Form 8839, qualified adoption expenses. What I want to say here is that when we talk about the Form 8839, the bottom line here is that you have to make sure that the form or the adoption expenses apply to your specific case, okay? And so you can use the Form 8839 to report expenses related to adopting one or more children and claim the non-refundable adoption tax credit. Whether you claim the credit or exclusion, the maximum amount for this year is $19,950 per eligible child, subject to a phase-out range. If you remember earlier when we were going through the form, you saw 19,550, right? I mean 15,950. So that's the maximum threshold for this year. Maybe next year this will change. And you can claim this tax benefit for adopting a child under 18 with a partial credit if the child turned 18 in the year of adoption, or a permanently disabled individual of any age if they can't care for themselves. And the adoption tax credit is non-refundable, which means that if there is any credit over your qualified expenses, you will not be able to get a check or a deposit for the rest of the credit. However, you can roll over any remaining adoption credit to future tax years once you have paid all your taxes for the year you first claimed the credit. So this is kind of important. Some phase-out ranges for the adoption credit. So regardless of your filing status, the phase-out range for the adoption credit or exclusion is the same. So taxpayers with let's say modified adjusted gross income that is about $280,000 or more cannot claim either benefits, while taxpayers with a modified adjusted gross income of $240,000 or less can claim the full amount up to $15,950 per eligible child. Really important. And so mega amount, so modified adjusted gross income amounts, between these amounts will reduce the amount of the benefits. And one thing I need to say here is that married taxpayers generally need to file jointly to claim the credit or exclusion, but there are exceptions such as legal separation, one taxpayer providing more than half of the child support, the eligible child living with one taxpayer for more than half of the year. I mean, there are situations where you have to adapt to what the family life is calling for, and you have to exclude employer-provided adoption benefits from income. So employer-provided adoption benefits will typically be reported on Form W-2 and with code T in box 12. So if this amount is not reported on Form W-2, you can still take the exclusion if your employer helped with the cost through a qualified adoption assistance program and you finalize the adoption of a child with special needs in the same tax year. And if the adoption benefits actually do not cover all of your adoption expenses, you claim the credit on the unreimbursed expenses. Let me break it down for you. Let's say, for example, you spend $10,000 in eligible adoption expenses, and your employer's program reimburses $4,000. So the maximum amount that you could use to compute the adoption credit will be 6,000 in Part 2 of Form 8839, while the exclusion would be worth only about 4,000. You must still fill out Part 3 if you received any adoption benefits from your employer, regardless of whether they were reported on Form W-2, and even if you are not claiming the exclusion. Okay, and so it is what it is. Boss, I'm going to quickly remind you of today's topic. We are having a conversation about Form 8839. I want to quickly talk to you about the qualified adoption expenses. I know I spoke about it a little earlier, but I have to really insist on that because the IRS is really adamant and making sure that the taxpayers go by the specific rules regarding the qualified adoption expenses. If you do not actually go by the rules, your expenses on Form 8839 will be denied, and you might be barred from claiming future adoption expenses on future forms 1040. So be very careful here. So any reasonable and necessary expenses directly related to adopting an eligible child are eligible for the credit or exclusion. Let me repeat that. So important. Any reasonable and necessary expenses directly related to adopting an eligible child are eligible for the credit or exclusion. So we're speaking about a broad constellation of expenses here, but the primary ones revolve around fees paid to adoption agencies, and those adoption agencies must be licensed at the state level or the federal level, or they might actually have if they are foreign, if they are incorporated outside the United States, they must be able to provide you with a receipt. Like they must be legit. Like if the IRS want to really check them out, they have to be able to trace them and see exactly that they are legit. And also, you can actually claim legal and court costs. We're speaking about anything that relates to family court. Yes, this will work. Travel, meals, and lodging. This is really important. So travel, meals, and lodging also, if you have to go outside the states, you have to travel to a foreign country, and you have to really stay somewhere, like at a lodge or accommodation, whatever. Basically, you can actually write those off. And re-adoption expenses if adopting a foreign child, as I said earlier. And so it's one of those things where you have to, again, make sure that you comply with the rules. And please make sure that you document everything. The receipts, the paper trail has to be clean, has to be in top shape. And because if the IRS were to ask you, you should be able to provide those pieces of information at a moment's notice. It doesn't have to be really complicated for you to find that data. You have to be able to find the data real fast. What are the steps I want you to really pay attention to here? So when we talk about qualified adoption expenses, you just have to understand that it's one of those things where you have to. Again, I spoke to you earlier about the maximum credit being $15,950. But one thing I need to insist here is that you may actually qualify for some exclusions or credits at the state level as well. I mean, everything that I've been telling you so far actually applies to the federal level, but all states have similar sort of rules for adoption credits. So you want to actually check with the authorities in your state to see how much you could qualify for, and if you qualify for something in the first place. Okay, just remember that the child that you actually that you adopted must live with you or live with your partner for more than half of the year. Okay, now if you and your partner are separated or in divorce proceedings, that's fine, but the child has to live with you to actually claim this credit, either at the federal level or at the state level. This is totally possible, and it's one of those things you have to understand that also you have to have the proper paperwork at the state level. Now, if you live in different states during the year, then you have to actually file paperwork with all the states in which you live. I mean, there could be instances where, for instance, you live in New York, but you work in Jersey, and the child was adopted from Pennsylvania or from Connecticut, for instance, or the child was adopted from France. France or Germany or India or Nigeria or Brazil, for instance. And so anytime you actually have maintained a presence in one state, whether professionally or residentially, you need to file paperwork at the end. You need to file tax paperwork at the end to justify to justify those adoption credits, especially if you are filing for exclusion or credits. One thing I want to say here is that when we talk about Form 8839, we need to understand that this is a living document. So basically, the thing is that if you adopt, we're not just speaking about qualified adoption expenses for for 1 year. If you adopt multiple children during the year, or anytime you adopt a child and you want to write off the cost associated with with this adoption, you really have to file this Form 8839. And it's really important to understand that, in some cases you might have to track actually all the fees you pay to agencies, that you pay to the court, you pay to lawyers, you have to pay to some other state agencies to actually justify your adoption process. One thing I want to say here is that in case you actually don't have a proper paper trail. In other words, you cannot really substantiate your claims. What you want to do is you want to reach out to the agencies where you conduct a business with and ask them for a statement. That works also, because there are cases where, let's say, God forbid, there was a storm, or there was there was a fire in your house and you lost everything. And how do you actually reconstruct evidence that you actually paid those organizations? Well, you reach out to them, contact them, and you give your child's name and give the dates, the approximate date around which the transaction occurred, and the organization should be able to provide you with that data itself. I mean, it's one of those things where we always tell our clients to do all that. You want to prioritize electronic transactions. So instead of paying somebody by check or paying an organization by check for adoption cost, it's just better to wire the money to them. That way you have a trace, you have a banking trace, and if there is anything in the future, you just have to look at your bank statements and know exactly what kind of ACH transfers you made to that organization. Now, the organization has to have an EIN, an enrolled age, and it has to have an employer identification number, and it must be legit. Okay, this is totally possible if you are trying to reconstruct things. Yeah, you can really reconstruct your data by reaching out to the organization, and the same applies to state agencies also. If you can't find how much you pay them, or if you pay them something at all, you just reach out to them, and they should be able to look into their records and give you exactly what you need. But just remember that Form 8839 is for each individual child that you are adopting, and you can file the form at the aggregate level, but it's just better to do things individually, so you can maximize your tax return. I mean, your tax refund, rather. You can maximize your tax refund. Thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. In today's conversation, I was just talking to you about Form 8839. So we are talking about, I gave you the overview, I gave you the approach, I gave you the steps, and now I'm doing the recap. Thank you so much. God bless you. I'll see you next time. Until then, remember, stay marvelous.